asked, very beginning of Ecclesiastes chapter 1 and verse 3, what profit has a man from all his labor in which he toils under the sun? And most of the book, as we've talked about, is about that particular idea. That phrase, under the sun, frames that for us to let us know that what he's talking about is life that's viewed from a purely earthly perspective. That if your life is only centered around this life, then you're going to be, at the very best, sorely disappointed. He asked the question, basically, what profit is there in life when it's viewed from that purely earthly perspective? What value is it in our labor? How valuable is it when we fail to consider God's will in our lives? And his answer, he's already answered the question. In fact, he begins answering the question with the second verse of the first chapter. When he says, vanity of vanities, says the preacher, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. And then, after he makes some observations in chapter 1, verse 14, he says, I have seen all the works that are done under the sun, and indeed all is vanity, and grasping for the wind. How did he reach this conclusion? Well, as we work our way through the book, we're going to notice that he did it in two areas, basically. By personal experience. He talked a lot about that in chapters 1 and 2. And in what we're looking at now, we're looking at his personal observations in these next several chapters, chapters 3 through 6. When we talked about his observations, we noticed that he talked about one of the reasons why this is so difficult is because God's ways are sometimes beyond our explanation. And then he ponders why injustice is allowed to exist. He continues to share his observations by talking about oppression. Well, let's begin with chapter 4. As he talks about the fact that we see around us how men oppress men, how men disappoint men. And then he's going to talk about how that even when we do our best, it is not going to be appreciated by everybody. So objectives in studying this chapter include to reflect upon the preacher's observation gleaned from his search for purpose of life under the sun, to consider the vanity of skillful work, isolation, and popularity, and to appreciate the value of friendship and working together. First, he talks about oppression in chapter 4, verses 1, 2, and 3. Here's what he says. Then I returned and considered all the oppression that is done under the sun, and look, the tears of the oppressed, but they have no comforter. On the side of their oppressors there is power, but they have no comforter. Therefore I praise the dead who are already dead, more than the living who are still alive. Yet better than both is he who never existed, who has not seen the evil work that is done under the sun. He began looking at this concept of oppression in Ecclesiastes chapter 3. Ecclesiastes chapter 3, verses 16 and 17. He says, moreover, I saw under the sun in the place of judgment, wickedness was there, and in the place of righteousness, iniquity was there. I said in my heart, God will judge the righteous and the wicked, for there is a time there for every purpose and for every work. So he says, I looked around and I saw all of this oppression. Here he specifies that it's even worse when you are oppressed and there's no one there to encourage you. You have no comforter. When he talks about oppression here in verse 1, when he says the tears of the oppressed, he's talking about those who are subject to high-handed injustice, offensive selfishness, hindrances to one's neighbor's well-being, caused by a man's careless regard of anything but his own interest, much like the drivers in Jonesboro, Arkansas. You watch them, and you better if you're driving, because if you don't, you are a part of one of the largest demolition derbies in the state of Arkansas. I saw a sign when I was in Blytheville the other day. They've got I guess they've got the fair or something coming up. They had a sign about their demolition derby, and I said, shoot, I see that every day. It's this idea that you don't really matter. What matters is what you do for me. Solomon saw the tears of the oppressed, those who had no comforter, no friend, no one to wipe away their tears. Now, over in Isaiah said there's going to be a time when that is not the case, at least for the faithful for God. In Isaiah chapter 25 and verse 8, he says, he will swallow up death forever, speaking of the Lord. And the Lord God will wipe away all tears from all faces. The rebuke of his people he will take away from the earth, for the Lord has spoken. Solomon was able to observe the power. And that word power, by the way, that's violence, is what that means. The violence on the side of the oppressors. Now, keep in mind that while Solomon did justice and righteousness, many of the other nations did not. That description of Solomon we find in 1 Kings chapter 10 and verse 9. The Queen of Sheba has come to see Solomon. She's seen what he has built. She's heard him speak. And her conclusion is, chapter 10, verse 9 of 1 Kings, blessed be the Lord your God, who delighted in you, setting you on the throne of Israel, because the Lord has loved Israel forever. Therefore he made you king to do justice and righteousness. Now, as we look at some of these things, keep in mind that we are talking about not Solomon's experiences, but Solomon's observations of what's going on in the world around him. And many of the other nations did not treat their people well. Someone has noted the point here is not merely that there is power, that's talked about in verse 1, but that power is corrupting. So, on the basis of what we see here, we might conclude that Solomon is sympathetic to those who are in all of this trouble, those who are suffering because of this oppression at the hands of those who don't really care about them. But when you look over in 2 Chronicles chapter 8, you find out that even the wisest man who ever lived did not escape guilt. 2 Chronicles chapter 8, verses 7 and 8 says, all the people who were left of the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, who were not of Israel, that is, their descendants who were left in the land after them, whom the children of Israel did not destroy, from these Solomon raised forced labor, as it is to this day. Solomon oppressed thousands of Canaanite people, making slaves of them to do his work. He did not, he goes on to say in 2 Chronicles chapter 8, he did not enslave Jews, Israelites. He didn't do that. But he placed a burden upon them that they wanted to get rid of when Solomon left the scene and Rehoboam took his place. So, someone has said, even though Solomon saw all of this suffering, he just kind of stood by and looked and didn't do anything to help. Solomon We're talking about Solomon being the wisest man who ever lived, had all of that wisdom, all of these resources available to him. But have you ever been around someone who is just so smart he can't relate to an average person? Besides me, of course. I have. I've been around people that were just so brilliant that they had zero common sense. They had no way of relating to just a regular person. Solomon was probably like that because his wisdom separated him from the average person. And that made it hard for him, at the very least. Solomon, who has the reputation of being the wisest man who ever lived, could not hold a candle to Jesus. Because Jesus was a greater than Solomon. He said he was in Matthew chapter 12. Matthew chapter 12, the usual suspects, the scribes and the Pharisees, wanted to have him do a magic trick for them. They wanted him to produce some kind of sign. Not that it would have made any difference because they weren't going to accept it. And his response to them was not a sign, but a record. He said, beginning with verse 39 of Matthew chapter 12, "But he answered and said to them, An evil and adulterous generation seeks a sign, and no sign will be given to it except the sign of the prophet Jonah. For Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the great fish. So will the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. The men of Nineveh will rise up in judgment with this generation and condemn it, because they repented at the preaching of Jonah, and indeed a greater than Jonah is here. The queen of the south will rise up in judgment with this generation and condemn it, for she came to the ends of the earth to hear the wisdom of Solomon, and indeed a greater than Solomon is here." But what made, well, obviously he's the Son of God, but what was it about Jesus that made him greater than someone like Solomon?
He felt compassion on him.
Because Jesus proved who he was and what he knew by what he did. There's an example of that in Luke chapter 7. In Luke chapter 7, and I've read some things about this that I don't know that they really get the picture. Because I've read some that look at this and they say, well, John the Baptist was kind of shaken in his faith. And so he's from prison, sent some disciples to ask Jesus if he was really the one they were expecting, or should they look for somebody else? Here's what the account says. This is Luke chapter 7, beginning with verse 18. "Then the disciples of John reported to him concerning all these things," that is, all the miracles and things Jesus was doing. "And John, calling 2 of his disciples to him, sent them to Jesus, saying, 'Are you the coming one, or do we look for another?' When the men came to him, they said, 'John the Baptist is sent to you, saying, Are you the coming one, or do we look for another?' And that very hour he cured many infirmities, afflictions, evil spirits, and to many blind he gave sight. Jesus answered and said to them, 'Go and tell John the things that you have seen and heard, that the blind see, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, the poor have the gospel preached to them, and blessed is he who is not offended because of me.'" I am more inclined to think that John did that not for his own benefit, but for the benefit of his disciples, who needed to see and understand that Jesus was the one. And the answer that Jesus gave was perfect, of course, because that answer was, well, what have you just seen? What have you heard? Go tell John that. John already knew. When John baptized him, John knew. So Jesus was different. He's greater than Solomon, not just because he's the Son of God, but as we saw him walk the earth, he was one who proved what he knew by what he did. Now, the preacher, of course, getting back to Ecclesiastes chapter 4, when he observes the oppression that's going on with the people in the world, his conclusion was, if this is all there is to it, then, verses 2 and 3, the dead who are already dead, they're better off than the ones who are still alive. In fact, somebody who's never been born is better off than the one who's already passed away or the one that's still alive. He praised the dead more than the living. And they tell me that this phraseology here is a reference to those who are long dead, people in the past, far in the past, are better off than those who are living. Better is the person who's never existed, who's not seen all of this evil that's done under the sun, was his conclusion. Much like what Job said in Job chapter 3, when he basically, I guess you could say, cursed the day of his birth. In Job chapter 3, verse 11, he says, why did I not die at birth? Why did I not perish when I came out of the womb? He said, why was I even born if this is what I've got to look forward to? If you look at life through a purely earthly perspective, that's the conclusion you'll draw. Any questions or comments before we move to his next subject? Okay, next he talks about the vanity of skillful and selfish work. Ecclesiastes chapter 4, verses 4 through 6. It says again, I saw that for all toil and every skillful work a man is envied by his neighbor. This is also vanity and grasping for the wind. The fool folds his hands and consumes his own flesh. Better a handful with quietness than both hands full together with toil and grasping for the wind. What's he talking about there? Well, verse 4 talks about the fact that when someone does well, he runs the risk of being envied by others. Have you ever heard the expression, a rising tide raises all ships? And it's true, it does. What does that mean? That means when something good happens for somebody, something good can happen for everybody. You encourage that. You don't discourage it. But a lot of times what happens is that when someone excels at something, somebody else is standing there ready to tear them down. Ready to say disparaging things about them. Ready to find fault with what they do. I was told, I'd never seen this, thank goodness. But I was told of some people that were in a business meeting one day, church business meeting, and they, of course, went around the table to get everybody's input, and one fellow said, well, I don't really have anything to say, but you tell me what you think, and I'll tell you what's wrong with it. There are people like that. And the wise man Solomon is saying, yeah, that's what happens. The preacher says, you do well, you work hard, you produce, you excel at something, and then someone else sees you and they deride that. They don't like that because they can't do it. They're not encouraging, they're discouraging. So what's the answer? Well, if you do well and people aren't going to appreciate it, do you just not do anything? Well, no, because that's what verse 4 is about, or verse 5 is about. Verse 5 says, the fool folds his hands and consumes his own flesh. That phrase, consumes his own flesh, is about, what it means is he goes about his own destruction. So the answer is not just to sit there and do nothing. The answer is, yeah, you do something, but you realize the value of it. What does it cost for you to be the best that there is? I am told, someone asked Zach Perlman one time, about what it took for him to play the violin the way he does. The person framed the declaration this way. He says, I would give my life if I could play like you play. And Perlman's response was, that's exactly what it took. The wise man, the preacher, says what makes more sense is to enjoy what you have, because you're better off with a handful of what you need than with 2 handfuls of stuff you don't. He said it another way in Proverbs chapter 15. In Proverbs chapter 15, verses 16 and 17. The wise man says, better is a little with the fear of the Lord than great treasure with trouble. Better is a dinner of herbs, or vegetables it could be, where love is, than a fatted calf with hatred. So, he's not saying don't work. He's not saying whatever you do is basically worthless. But he is saying recognize the difference between what you have and what you want, because it is different sometimes. Especially if there is no one there to share it with. That's what the next section's about, beginning with verse 7. Any questions or comments over the verses 4 through 6? All right, verses 7 through 12. Then I returned and saw vanity under the sun. There is one alone without companion. He has neither son nor brother. Yet there is no end to all his labors, nor is his eye satisfied with riches. But he never asks, for whom do I toil and deprive myself of good? This is also vanity and a grave misfortune. 2 are better than 1, because they have a good reward for their labor. For if they fall, one will lift up his companion. But woe to him who is alone when he falls, for he has no one to help him up. Again, if 2 lie down together, they will keep warm. But how can one be warm alone? Though one may be overpowered by another, 2 can withstand him. And a threefold cord is not quickly broken. Solomon says all of this work is really pointless if there is no one to share that with. He mentions in verses 7 and 8 that the person who is in this position is never going to really enjoy what he's got, and really he can't. You look over in Ecclesiastes chapter 5, verse 10, it says, he who loves silver will not be satisfied with silver, nor he who loves abundance with increase. This is also vanity. In other words, you're not going to be satisfied by things. Things will not do it. So if you're working by yourself, just because you can amass things, you'll never be satisfied with what you have. It just doesn't work. And then there's the problem of what happens with all of the things that you've produced when you're gone. That bothered Solomon. You look over in Ecclesiastes chapter 2 when he's talking about, I guess you could say, personal experiences. He says in verses 18 and 19, then I hated all my labor which I toiled under the sun, because I must leave it to the man who will come after me. And who knows whether he will be wise or a fool. Yet he will rule over all my labor which I toil, in which I have shown myself wise under the sun. This is also vanity. And it was for him, because his son caused, by his actions, the dividing of the kingdom into Samaria and Judea. So, Solomon was right to be concerned. He says, what's the point of all of that? For the fellow who's working alone, who's just producing stuff because there's just something that he thinks he wants, He's never going to be satisfied with that effort. But with a friend, with a companion, things are different. Verses 9 through 12. 2 are better than 1, he says, because they have good reward in their labor. It's much better to have friends because friends can help you when you work. It's better to have friends because friends can help each other when they fall. A lot of the traveling that people would do in that period of time was over some paths that weren't very even. And so it would be easy for someone to fall. Might be hard for... I have discovered that it's a lot harder to get up than it used to be. And part of it is not because... Well, I don't really know why that is, except that now I'm afraid of hurting my knees or hurting my elbows or hurting, just getting hurt somehow. And so I take extra precautions to keep that from happening. And it's, turns out sometimes to be a show bigger than the Ringling Brothers. It's embarrassing. But it's easier if you got somebody to help you. And that's the point of Solomon here. We help each other, friends who can help each other when they fall. Friends that can help each other withstand forces of opposition. That's verse 12. Though one may be overpowered by another, two can withstand him, and a threefold cord is not quickly broken. You've got somebody to help you when you need it. And that's important. It has always been important. Solomon in Proverbs wrote these things. Proverbs chapter 17, verse 17. A friend loves at all times, and a brother is born for adversity. Proverbs chapter 18, verse 24. A man who has friends must himself be friendly, but there is a friend who sticks closer than a brother. Proverbs chapter 27, verses 6. Faithful are the wounds of a friend, but the kisses of an enemy are deceitful. 9 and 10 of chapter 27. Ointment and perfume delight the heart, and the sweetness of a man's friend gives delight by hearty counsel. Do not forsake your own friend or your father's friend. Do not go to your brother's house in the day of calamity, because better is a neighbor nearby than a brother far away. Makes perfect sense, doesn't it? Proverbs chapter 27, verse 17. As iron sharpens iron, so a man sharpens the countenance of his friend. It is important for us to have friends. I don't believe God intends for people to be isolated. Now, there are some folks who like to be hermits, who like to just stay away from folks. I understand that. I watch some National Geographic shows, people up in Alaska and things like that, and they're off the grid. Some of them are way off the grid. And they may not see anybody for months, and that's okay with them because that's their choice. That's how they want to live, and that's fine. Most of us are not built that way. Most of us are social creatures. We want to have connection with others. Solomon says it's a good thing because there are some positives there. You have help when you need it. You have encouragement when you need it. You have sometimes protection when you need it. And you can't depend on popularity because popularity is a fleeting thing. That's how he closes chapter 4. This is verses 13 through 16. Before we go further, is there any questions or comments over what we've talked about so far?
So is that why he had 700 wives? He was trying to make sure he was not alone? I mean, what in the world? It's crazy.
He is a glutton for punishment, wasn't he?
I mean, no kidding. What was he thinking?
When I look at that, my first impression is most of those marriages were strategic
Right.
in nature.
Because they were mostly princesses, yeah.
But when you read, and I have to do this off the top of my head, so it's not
He also
going to
didn't live,
work.
they probably had their own quarters and.
Oh, well, yeah.
It says of him, as he built things for them, and as he built worship places for them, that his heart was turned from God because he loved them.
Well, it's like.
So
1
there was
Kings
more to
11:3.
it. There was more to it than just a political alliance being considered there. Now, how in the world that worked? Probably not very well. 700 wives, 300 concubines, wives of a lower rank. And we thought he was the wisest man in the world. Anyway,
I mean,
that was a
seriously
problem
though,
for
like,
him.
A lot of people.
That's like the whole town of Mammoth Spring, 1,000 people.
Yes.
That's my entire hometown. And that was his female companionship.
That was it.
It's crazy.
Can you imagine? Okay, let's see. I'll book you for next
I'm just like, what the heck in
April.
the world?
April the 12th. Okay. I can't imagine that. I really can't. I can't. But especially when it wasn't just political. I mean, the political part, I understand all of that. That's
Right.
they did stuff like that all the time. But Solomon cared about these people. At least some of them.
Right.
That's kind of strange.
Well, I mean, that's what it says there in 1 Kings 11:3.
It
God
does.
turned his heart away.
That I don't understand.
I know that doesn't really have anything to do with Ecclesiastes, sorry, but I just.
Well, actually, it has a lot to do with Ecclesiastes, because as he works his Ecclesiastes is a journey of a man back to God. And it says in 1 Kings chapter 11? It says in 1 Kings chapter 11 that they turned his heart from God. So he's on his way back. I believe that Solomon repented by the end of his life, and I believe Ecclesiastes, especially when you get to the end of chapter 12, is evidence of the fact. He understood finally that God had given him all of these resources just to prove to him that you can't find purpose in just this life alone. But he had every resource to prove or disprove that. And he proved that was true. Friends need to be true friends because popularity vanishes. Verses 13 through 16. Better a poor and wise youth than an old and foolish king who will be admonished no more. For he comes out of prison to be king. Although he was born poor in his kingdom, I saw all the living who walk under the sun, that they were with the second youth who stands in his place. There was no end of all the people over whom he was made king. Yet those who come afterward will not rejoice in him. Surely this is also vanity and grasping for the wind. Solomon says, from his observation, that there is no advantage to being popular. Because one of these days, that popularity is going to pass. So you see things like this in, once again, in the book of Proverbs. Proverbs chapter 19 and verse 4. Wealth makes many friends, but the poor is separated from his friend. Verse 6. Many entreat the favor of the nobility, and every man is a friend to one who gives gifts. When you're on top, everybody wants to be your buddy. But when you're on top, there's only one direction left to go. And that's down. the experience of Solomon, what he saw, was that someone would rise up through the ranks. He'd do well. He'd wind up at the top. And then he had no sooner gotten to the top than people started looking for his replacement. And isn't that the way it works in every aspect of life? I was listening to the radio coming in, and the people that were on it were talking about, they said they were talking about the first concert they ever went to. And I said, thought to myself, the first concert I ever went to was, and I don't remember. But they were famous. Whoever they were, oh yeah, because they're all dead now? Is that what you're saying? A bunch of them are. In fact, the Shipley, Brewer and Shipley just passed away. You don't know who those are? That's okay. You've heard the song, I guarantee you. One Toke Over the Line was the song. That was the only hit that I know of. So you've heard the song. But that's the thing. You see, fame doesn't last. Fame doesn't last. And people who gravitate towards you because you are on top are doing that because of what you can do for them, what I like to call the utility principle, which is you have value as long as you can do something for me. When you can no longer do something for me, you have no value to me or for me. And that's what Solomon is warning against there. So, as Solomon is concluding these observations about the vanity of life, he's talked about in these 2 chapters that there are things about God we don't understand. We don't understand how there can be injustice and oppression. We can't understand why it is sometimes that you can work hard and do your best and it's not appreciated. So, what's the best thing to do under the sun? Well, what he said was earlier in chapter 3, verses 12 and 13, to rejoice, do good, and to enjoy the good of one's labor. But here is why, chapter 3, verse 13. And also that every man should eat and drink and enjoy the good of all his labor. It is the gift of God. You can't leave God out of it and be satisfied with it. And he also talked about, of course, as we just talked about, the value of friends who can help us in time of need. That's something that we all need. 2 are better than 1 because they have good reward for their labor. Sometimes we don't understand what God does, but we do know, as we talked about last week, that he works for our benefit. Romans chapter 8, verse 28. We have the family of God to help us in our labor and in our time of need. 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 11. We could obtain mercy and find grace to have help in time of need, Hebrews chapter 4 says, because of what Jesus has done. Questions or comments over what we've talked about? Lord willing, next Sunday morning we'll be looking at, we'll begin with chapter 5, look at chapters 5 and 6 as he continues his observation.